welcome to ILTV's Elections Arena. I'm Aaron Porras, and today in the ring, elections are finally over and done with in Israel. The new coalition is officially sworn in, and we are now entering the age of the nation's biggest unity and rotational government. Joining us is political strategist and director of English operations with the Yamina Party, Jeremy Saltan, and strategic advisor, Yoram Dori. Now, to begin, with 35 ministers, including for the first time co-prime ministers Netanyahu and Gantz, Israel's 35th government is up and running.
הממשלה החדשה הוקמה ברצונם של רוב אזרחי ישראל, והיא תשרת את כל אזרחי ישראל.
But what does a unity mean for the running of the country, especially with Gantz and Netanyahu sharing the premiership? Jeremy, I actually want to start with you on this one. How will Netanyahu share powers with Gantz, especially with Gantz, being under Netanyahu for the first 18 months?
The most important thing in a government is trust. And I'll tell you something, Netanyahu and Gantz do not have the best trust relationship going into this, right? There is a coalition agreement, and what Gantz is expecting is whatever is written there, that Netanyahu is going to live up to each and every letter and every single comma in every single period. Well, I can tell you already, when they went ahead and they had the inauguration back on Sunday, it was quite amusing to see Netanyahu already break it with the presentation of his government. He promised that the right bloc would only present 18 ministers. Well, he already went ahead and presented 19 ministers. So I guess in that way, the annexation is already starting. So, on the right, I should be happy about that. But what I would expect is to find areas in which Gantz is going to try to show that he too has muscles and try to go ahead and prevent Netanyahu from really making him look like the dwarf within this relationship.
Well, but beyond that, Netanyahu has a reputation for micromanaging certain ministerial portfolios. He even held 5 portfolios at the same time during the last government. Do you think that he's going to maybe fight with Gantz over certain powers?
No, I don't think so. I remember, I'm old. I'm not young anymore. I remember the 1984 National Unity Government. The mistrust between Mr. Shamir and Mr. Peres were much more than the mistrust between Mr. Gantz, who was the chief of staff of Prime Minister of Netanyahu. Don't forget it. And they learn how to work together, because if both sides wants the best for the state of Israel, they find a way to work together. And I'm sure that they will work together, and in 1.5 years, we'll see the rotation.
So I was actually...
I'm not. I'll be honest. I don't think Benny Gantz is going to be prime minister. I don't think Netanyahu has any intention of allowing this to actually happen. One of the most interesting parts of the coalition agreement that was signed between the two parties was that, yes, if Netanyahu goes ahead and breaks the agreement, then the premiership is supposed to go to Gantz. But there's one exception, and that's if it happens to be something that has to do with the state budget. So let's see if we can even get through this budget, because if Benny Gantz, according to the coalition agreement, does not support the budget, Netanyahu remains prime minister, even with all of the serious, and really they have a lot of ammo that they put into this coalition agreement to try to keep those two together. Look, the level of mistrust...
But would it even really be within Netanyahu's interests to break this coalition down and leave Gantz as, not as speaker of the Knesset, but
he's no longer speaker of the Knesset. Right now he's defense minister. And again, if he does not support the budget, then he's just an opposition member. Look, Netanyahu is a person who cares about his own interests. If he's able to figure out a way to get to 61 without Gantz, and it's possible that we will see which players within the left bloc of this unity government is willing in the future to break off, then Netanyahu will go ahead and do so and find his first opportunity.
Yeah. I don't want to defend Mr. Netanyahu. I'm not his supporter. But I'm sure that in November 28, 2021, Mr. Gantz will be the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, I'm sure. I remember, as I told you, the 1984 National Unity Government. Everybody questions if Mr. Peres will be replaced by Mr. Shamir. And although he had 80% of population, he did it. Because, life are sometimes stronger than politics.
It's not the 1980s anymore. Let's be honest.
Well, so let's go into that, because I want to know, in what other ways does that rotational unity compared to this one? Because you said, okay, the trust issue is one factor. In what other ways do they maybe differ, or are they similar?
No, they are similar. They are different. That the agreement is guaranteed by law, and it was on goodwill at the 1984 government because of the good relations between Mr. Sharon and Mr. Shachal, who created this national government, not because of the relations between Mr. Shamir and Mr. Peres. But you can see that, like 1984, the prime minister or the designated prime minister, that's the name that Mr. Shamir was called from 1984 to 1986, and then Mr. Peres, designated prime minister, has a veto on every subject that you can put on the agenda of the government. If you have a veto on every subject, you know what is the power of a prime minister of Israel, that he can put on the agenda of the government whatever he wants. Now he can't.
All right, well, speaking of threats to the government's success, opposition leader and former blue and white number 2 Yair Lapid had nothing good to say about the new unity. Take a look.
כי הישראלים הם כל מיני דברים, פריירים הם לא. הממשלה הזו לא מייצגת אותם, לא קמה בשבילם, לא רואה אותם ממטר. מגיע להם יותר, ואנחנו נהיה פה כדי לתת להם יותר.
Now, Jeremy, you started actually hinting at this, that this unity will fall in some form or another. Either Netanyahu will try and back out of it or some other way. Do you think, I mean, how likely do you think that this will fail? When do you think it will fail? Will Yair Lapid play a part in it, as he's said he might?
I don't think any of this has anything to do with Yair Lapid. I'm sure he wishes that it did, but it's really not going to come down to anything that he says or does. Look, this is very different than 1980s, right? It's important to look at the structure of what we're dealing with now. Benny Gantz's party, I'm not talking about his faction, I'm not talking about his bloc, his party is just 15 MKs. There has never been a prime minister in Israel with 15 MKs. One of the reasons why we knew the Peres and Shamir government, even though we were not necessarily sure that there would be a handover, is that both sides had 40 plus mandates. They had 40 plus mandates in the election before that. You had two very strong bases. Here you have Benny Gantz, who's a rookie politician, who the entire reason why he came into politics was to replace Netanyahu, and now he is his junior member and supposed alternate prime minister. So the structure aspect is important. I don't think it's strong enough of a base, 15 seats in Knesset, to be able to go ahead and get to that seat. Additionally, I feel the two MKs of the Derech Eretz faction, as well as the two MKs from Labor out of the three that joined the coalition, have more influence over him than his own MKs do. I just don't look at him as someone who can be prime minister because he's not strong enough within the Knesset, within his bloc, within his faction, or frankly within his own party, where Ashkenazi looks more of a leader to me than Gantz does.
I learned something from Aubrey Eben, I think the best foreign minister of the state of Israel. Once I asked him, why is he supporting one guy in the Labour Party and not the other? He told me, young man, you have to understand that in politics you choose between unbearable and undesirable. And I think that undesirable is this government and unbearable our fourth election. And that's what Mr. Gantz decided to choose. And I think that this government will be a good, and I think that Jeremy and myself are praying together for the success of the government, although he is now in the opposition, because it's a government of all of us, and we want that this government will succeed.
So actually, let's talk about some of the members in the government. You spoke a moment ago about labor, sorry, and you're saying that you actually support the fact that they split off from the greater Labor Meretz party and joined the coalition. You still support that, despite leaving all these people in the opposition? How do you think that they're going to fare?
As I told you, you have to choose in politics. Politics is arithmetic, and after Mr. Gantz decided to join the government, I think that the Labour Party has no alternative. They have to join and to run to the next election together. Because if I'm looking on the minister of blue-white, more than 50% of them were born in the Labour Party, are Labour Party members in the past. the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Science, and others, and the Minister of Culture, etc. The Minister of Tourism, I think, Mr. Trooper. So you can see that is the Labour Party of the past.
So what about Rafi Peretz's choice to split from the Yamina party to join as Minister of Jerusalem Affairs? Do you think that he made the right decision, that Yamina did not? Same answer. Jeremy?
Well, obviously, I'm going to disagree with that position. Look, Rav Rafi Peretz is obviously a war hero, and he did great things before he entered politics. But to be quite honest, I don't think that over the last year we've really seen any accomplishments that have come out of both his time as education minister and his time as an MK. Look, it's his decision. He thinks that he can represent religious Zionism within the coalition. He, for whatever reason, believes that he's going to have some influence. To me, it just reminds me of the time where Daniel Hershkovitz, who again is a very nice guy and a person who I consider to be my friend, decided to go in and become the science and technology minister. Let's be honest, the direction of this government, as we just heard, is one of the left. Look, Amir Peretz is getting he's the new economy minister. You have Itzik Shmuley, who's the new welfare minister. Former labor ministers are now in charge of tourism, agriculture, culture and sport, and other key ministries. We know that also within the left-wing side of blue and white, I was about to say Nissenkorn, who is perhaps the most left of those who are not former Labor Party members, is in charge of justice, and we heard what he said yesterday when he took office from Amir Ohana. So to me, when I'm going ahead and looking at a situation where defense, foreign affairs, justice, culture, communications, virtually every important ministry is in the hands of the left, I really ask Rafi Peretz, why do you think this very coveted position of Minister of Jerusalem and Heritage Affairs is going to have any impact? And to me, really what bothers me the most about it, he signed in his coalition agreement with Likud that he's going to, whatever happens in the question of sovereignty or annexation, he will defer to whatever Netanyahu and the Likud and the coalition along with the Labor Party decides for him. Someone who is elected by his constituents to go ahead really and paint a clear picture of where it is that they want to see themselves as first-class citizens of this country are unfortunately not going to see that from Rav Rafi Peretz.
I want to say something about Minister Rafi Peretz. Politicians are also human beings with desires. And I think I'm putting me in his position. He understood that Mr. Bennett and Ayelet Shaked are negotiating in order to get portfolios or to become ministers without him. So he said, what they can do, I can do better.
I find it very interesting that you're choosing to take Yair Netanyahu's tweets and make that your new talking points. If you want a scoop, I'm happy to give you one. Rav Rafi Peretz, he went on Thursday to meet the Prime Minister after Netanyahu chose to cancel the meeting with Bennett. He decided to invite Peretz instead. Rav Peretz told us he was going into the meeting. Of course, after he cut a deal for himself, he forgot to call us back and let us know what was happening with his attempt to bring all of us into the coalition for him. So yes, a lot of times you're right, politicians do think about what position that they could have, but when you're part of a party, especially when you say that you're going to represent the members of that party,
what would it have taken for Bennett to say we're joining?
There was not one meeting between the outgoing defense minister, Naftali Bennett, who just handed over to Benny Gantz yesterday, and Benjamin Netanyahu since April 20th, when Benny Gantz signed that coalition agreement with Benjamin Netanyahu. There was not one meeting. There were phone calls, there were Skype conversations. There was not one meeting. He met countless times with Shas, with UTJ, with many factions within the blue and white, with labor as well. He didn't.
You're saying he wasn't really interested in having Yamina in the coalition in the first place.
It was very clear he was not. There was never any coalition team that was sent out to go ahead and have a serious talk with us. Labor had a coalition team with blue and white. They went ahead, they dealt with the details. You have to talk about committee appointments. It's a very complicated process governing. We never had any coalition team sit with us. We never had one meeting. There's only one person who had a meeting. There was Rabbi Rafi Peretz, and he's a minister in the government. The rest of us are not. I can only imagine what happened in that meeting.
I have two comments.
Yes.
One, that rabbis don't have to deal with politics. That's a good advice for me, from a non-religious Jew to religious Jew. Please leave the rabbis as teachers and not as politicians.
I agree.
That's one. The second one, you know, as I told you, I'm not so young. So I remember the last election of 2013, where Shaked and Bennett forced Netanyahu to give them the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Justice. I'm sure that Mr. Netanyahu didn't forget what happened 7 years ago, because politicians don't forget anything.
All right, well, I want to speak a little bit.
And he behaved towards them like they behaved towards him.
That was
All right,
2015.
Well, I want to speak a little bit
Okay.
about Bennett, actually, because he's now officially handed off the defense ministry position to Benny Gantz, as you mentioned, who will hold the position for the next 18 months. Take a look.
בני, אני מעביר לך את השרביט כאשר מדינת ישראל נמצאת במצב ביטחוני טוב ויציב, שקט במיוחד.
Now, Yoram, I actually want to turn to you. Naftali Bennett took it upon himself as defense minister, even an interim defense minister for 6 months, to aggressively tackle issues like the coronavirus and aiding within the coronavirus, as well as defending the borders. Do you think he did a good job?
I'm sure he did a very good job. I read an op-ed, I think 6 months ago, that all the fight against the coronavirus has to be in the hands of the Ministry of Defense. And I'm sure that if the steering committee were headed by the Minister of Defense and the Ministry of Defense, we were with less casualties on the economic side.
So now that he's not in the coalition anymore, but he has this, career of successes behind him, how do you think his career in the future is going to look? In what direction would you say he's going or should go? Because, he's positioned himself as an alternative to the Likud oftentimes. Do you think that that's a reality in his future?
Yes, why not?
Jeremy?
Yeah, for sure. Look, what we're going to be able to do, and this is something you can do in the opposition, it's much more difficult to do this in the coalition, is to paint a clear alternative to, again, what the Likud is trying to do. The Likud gave all these positions to the left. I expect that they're going to go to the left.
It's sounding more and more like Netanyahu didn't want Yamina in, and Yamina didn't want to join.
Well, again, Netanyahu did not want us, and the reason he did not want us is because he wanted to go ahead and go in a different direction. If until now Bennett has been able to keep Netanyahu to the right, without Bennett and Shaked in there keeping him to the right, he's going to now go over to his friends in the Labor Party and he's going to move more to the left. I'll make a prediction here that in July, everyone's talking about this vote we're going to have on applying Israeli sovereignty, or as some people like to call it, annexation. I don't believe that's going to happen. And, people in labor are going to say, listen, that's why we're in the government. Well, when that happens, that's the reason why we are not in the government. We will have an alternative right-wing option for voters when we get to the next election.
I understand the enthusiasm to be in opposition, but I worked with Mr. Peres when he was in the opposition. I know how I ran after any Knesset correspondent to have 2 words in the 17th page in the press, in the newspaper. It is very hard to be in Israel in the opposition. It's not easy.
I remember being in the opposition. I've been in the opposition before. It's not as bad as people are trying to make it out to be. It's true that in the coalition agreements that you signed, you took a lot of the committee chairs that used to be given to the opposition, and I don't think that's a good thing for our democracy. But what I can tell you is this: Bennett was the best defense minister that we had in the last 20 years. And this is something that even yourself needs to agree that when you're comparing him to his predecessors, he did an outstanding job. So I don't think it's going to be a problem. When he wants to get his words heard, I think the journalists are going to be out there with a pen and notepad in hand.
Bennett has positioned himself
quite
quite often in front of the press. Do you think he's going to have suddenly more problems than he had before?
Of course.
But why would he have such a difficulty with that?
Because I know the press.
Because
I know the press.
When people have accomplishments, and again, when you're looking at Bennett's term in the defense ministry, that's accomplishments.
You can see that in the last 2-3 days, you can hear only ministers. You don't hear the opposition.
That's because we just
Mr.
had
Bennett
an inauguration.
had a press conference. There was no coverage of the press conference.
Press
of
were not
Mr. Bennett.
invited to the press conference because of Corona. Now, once we enter a post-Corona time, I assure you that the journalists will be there to listen. But again, that's a side point. What matters is not the journalist, but the people, the citizens of the state of Israel. And what he went ahead there and showed was true leadership. You know, we just heard those words of him going ahead and giving over the baton over to Benny Gantz. That was the speech of a statesman. That was the speech of a leader. There are Israelis there, whether they agree with him politically, ideologically, or not, and saying, you know what, that is a candidate that in the future is going to be there, going ahead and contesting that prime minister spot. That's just a fact. Whether you like it or you don't like it, he's going to be there whenever this post-Netanyahu era comes upon us.
All right, well, speaking of some of the transfers of the ministry portfolios, we also have, I think we can agree from looking at the footage that Bennett's handoff to Gantz was pretty civil and respectful and very professional. But some of the other transfers have been a little less so. We have, for example, Yaakov Litzman leaving the health ministry, trash-talking his former aide.
I told you that rabbis don't have to be politicians.
You did say it. But now we also have Miri Regev, not a rabbi, who, before even entering her position, has fired the chief of the transportation, while she was on maternity leave, by the way. What does this say about their ways of management?
You know, one of the important things in Israeli politics, and we were talking about this beforehand in terms of government, but it's really in any position within politics, is trust, right? I did not always agree with every one of my employers within politics, but I will never, ever go on air and say publicly that I disagreed with any decision that they ever made or say anything bad about them. I think it's very telling that we see all the director generals who have been fired, a lot of them in very difficult ways, not saying one word at all badly about those who did that to them.
Yeah.
I think that every director general of a ministry in Israel has to put his resignation a day before a new minister is taking power. And I think that Karen Turner didn't do it,
From the transportation
unfortunately. But she had to do it.
You know, she was on maternity leave. Maybe she was
on maternity leave,
busy
but unfortunately,
taking care of her baby.
Well, unfortunately, I think we could talk about this forever, but we'll have to save that for next time. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I'd love to thank our guests, Yoram Dori and Jeremy Salton, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. And finally, remember that for more news from ILTV, please follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV channels. I'm Aaron Porras. Until next time.